My name is Luke Sheneman, and let me move this aside here somehow. Sorry, really want to get rid of this thing. Okay. All right. So my name is Luke Sheneman. I'm the Director of Research Computing and Data Services here at the University of Idaho, and I work within the Institute for Interdisciplinary Data Sciences. Our team does a lot to support research in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and I do some AI stuff as part of my work, mostly related to computer vision methods, applied computer vision for various problem domains. But I've been super interested in learning more about transformer models and specifically how those can empower large language models. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this is actually part 5 of a 5-part so far series on machine learning and Python that I've given as part of these tech talks. I gave 3 talks last semester, and this is the latest one so far. So let's see. Can I advance my slides? Okay, so in the first talk that I gave, kind of went over the basics of like, what is machine learning? How do you do very basic stuff in Python? We implemented a really simple handwriting recognition model using kind of not deep learning, really just sort of conventional, traditional machine learning methods like random forest and support vector machines and simple neural networks. And we did that just within the scikit-learn framework. And then we moved on to more advanced topics. And so in part 2, we talked about generative adversarial networks. So that's when we started using deep learning and convolutional neural networks. We used PyTorch to develop a couple of models that sort of cooperatively competed against each other to be able to generate new data. In this case, we generated human faces given a bunch of training data. That was really fun. And then we talked about semantic segmentation. So that is being able to label every pixel in an image. And in particular, we worked with drone data to try to semantically segment every pixel in the image from aerial drone imagery. And then finally moved on to diffusion models, which is the talk I gave last week, where so along the lines of Midjourney and Stable Diffusion and DALL-E, created a really simple diffusion model that again was able to generate human faces given a large training set. And so really fun, learned a ton with that, but now we're going to do something completely different. So this is a slide I've shared. This is the 3rd time I've shared this slide, but just talking a little bit about generative AI. So it's obviously in the news a lot lately. It's kind of hard to miss if you've paid any attention at all to what's going on in the world. It's kind of changing a lot of what we're doing. So there's obviously ChatGPT. There's DALL-E and Stable Diffusion and those kinds of things. There's all sorts of other generative AI tools that are out there that generate music and art, and people are using it to do science. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. So it's a huge thing, and a lot of it is being empowered by transformer models. And so I'm going to talk a bit I'll talk a lot about transformer models today. But really fundamentally, what generative AI is doing is you're basically learning this representation from a large amount of training data. You're learning what's called the latent representation, is really the distribution of your data in all sorts of dimensions. Like it's very hyperdimensional data usually that you're working with. And so you develop some sort of compressed latent representation of that data, and then you sample from it. And when you sample from it, you're generating something that is new, potentially, that is influenced by what's in that distribution of data. But so whether it's an image or a video or the next token in the sequence of stuff that you're getting from ChatGPT, that's really what you're doing, is you're just sampling from this distribution that you've learned through training a model. So what we're going to do today is we're going to build a model that basically mimics Shakespeare, right? So this is a Shakespeare GPT, that's what I call it, or I call it Shake GPT. And we're going to use this thing called the transformer model. By the way, that's an AI generated image of, I think it was like cyberpunk Shakespeare. And so we're going to learn from scratch what Shakespeare said in his works by basically absorbing his complete works and studying them. Or we're not going to do it, but our AI is. And then we're going to be able to emit after that. Once we have a trained model, we'll be able to just spew Shakespeare forever, right? And so kind of cool, kind of scary, but that's what we're going to do. So, but before I do that, since I don't know what level everybody is here as far as your experience with AI and machine learning and that sort of thing, but I'm going to recap a few things. The first is, just talk about the basics again. What is a neural network? Talk about tensors again, and then why GPUs are important and how we're going to use them. So again, machine learning is really this data-driven method for creating models for prediction, optimization, classification, things like that. And now generation through generative AI. There's all sorts of toolkits or frameworks that are out there. The most popular ones are TensorFlow and PyTorch. There's also simpler ones that have been around for a while, like scikit-learn. There are other frameworks as well, but those two, TensorFlow and PyTorch, are really the ones that are the most popular right now. And so again, what we do is we take a labeled training data. In this case, we're doing what's called supervised machine learning, where we have this training data set. In the case that I'm showing here, it's this thing called MNIST, which is really just this set of numeric, they're images of numbers that are handwritten, and they're labeled. So there's I think 70,000 of them or so, and each one of them has a label associated with what number that image represents. They're 28 pixels by 28 pixels. And so again, in the first talk that I did, we developed a simple neural network that, given all of the pixels in the image, is able to tell you, is it a 0, is it a 1, is it a 2, et cetera. And so that's what, that's an example of a labeled data set. We're going to work with a labeled data set today. Well, it's not labeled, but it is a data set that we're going to be able to use in a supervised machine learning form to train our GPT. And so neural network basics, right? This is what we call a fully connected network. Some, other names for it would be multi-level perceptron. This is kind of the traditional neural network where you have a set of input neurons in an input layer. And then you have some number of hidden layers in the middle. And those hidden layers everything's connected, right? So a fully connected network, everything from one layer is connected to the former and subsequent layers. And the magic kind of happens in those hidden layers, right? Those hidden layers take the previous data that's coming through the network, and they're able to if your network architecture is correct, it's able to learn to extract and use higher order features. And so you might provide an image as input, and then it's able to do feature extraction, put together those features in complicated ways, and then at the very end, you output whatever you need. And really what you're trying to do is optimize a set of weights. Those weights are sort of associated with the connections between the neurons. And those are just, just little numeric weights that you can tweak. The neurons themselves have weights, but we call them biases. And so those are also trainable parameters in your network. It's really easy in some of these frameworks to define a multi-level perceptron, like the one that's shown here. And basically what you do for any given neuron, you basically get the weighted sum of your inputs. You apply some sort of activation function, and then that provides your output, and then that's the output of the next layer. So a tensor, as I mentioned in prior lectures, is really just a data structure. Usually we think of them as matrices or arrays. You can have a rank 0 tensor, which is just a scalar value, a rank 1 tensor, which is like a vector of values, and then you have matrices, which are rank 2, and then you can have rank 3, and you can have arbitrarily sized, arbitrarily dimensioned tensors. And in deep learning, what you're really doing is you're moving tensors around and between layers. performing operations on those tensors, transforming those tensors. It's so much of your time when you get into the deep learning stuff is working with tensors and understanding the input shapes of a tensor, or of a particular layer, what kind of tensor shape it expects and what kind of tensor shape it needs to output for the next layer. And so you spend a lot of time working with that. In a fully connected neural network, again, in the example that I provided earlier, where we had this image, an image is really just a tensor, right? It's an order 2 tensor, two-dimensional matrix of values. You can have color, but in this case, we have just one layer, which is just intensity values. And then in the fully connected network example, what you would do is just kind of serialize your pixels in that 2D image. Those would be your inputs to your input layer, and you go from there. And again, you try to extract features. The hidden layers are, if your network is doing what it's supposed to be doing, should be trying to extract more than just pixel values, but do things like edge detection and stuff like that, and develop eventually higher order features and eventually very high order features that you then output. And that can be used for classification, segmentation, that sort of thing, for images. A lot of this is true for what we're going to be doing with text as well. And then just a quick note on GPUs, because a lot of what we're going to be doing with the transformer model today is a lot of matrix multiplication. And so GPUs are very, very important for this because they can do those operations in parallel. You can have a GPU that has tens of thousands of cores on it, and each one of those cores can be doing an operation in one clock cycle. So you can be doing lots of parallel dot products, which is most of what transformer models do, is dot products. And you can do those all at once, right? And so it's absolutely critical today to do anything with large language models to use GPUs. You get multiple orders of magnitude improvement by using them. Okay, so that's the background, kind of the boilerplate background I always give for these talks. But so transformer models. So transformer models are very different from what I'm used to, right? So I'm used to working with images using convolutional neural networks. Transformer models are very different. And we'll go into it. And you'll see this diagram repeated several times throughout this talk today. So back in the olden days, which was 5 years ago, people were working with large language models. They tried to use things like multi-level perceptrons, and that really just doesn't work because multi-level perceptrons can't really handle sequential data. They have no ability to really remember things. So if you have sequential data where it's important to remember your context as you're working through your model, they just don't really work. And so a new class of networks were developed called recurrent neural networks. And those are sort of shown here in the center here, which are kind of layered in a sequence. And the idea is that the output of one layer becomes the input of another. And really what you're doing is kind of tracking state as you move through this recurrent neural network. And those were great. And they did some new things that multi-level perceptrons couldn't do. But they had some problems. So first of all, training was slow because you had to train the model in serial, right? So there's certain operations here that you can't do in parallel. You have to train the layers sort of in order, which means it's slow. It's slow to train. The other problem is what's called the vanishing gradient problem, which is when you get very long or deep networks, as you're computing as you're optimizing the network, you're sort of tweaking these little dials, right? And your decisions on how to optimize that is based on this process called gradient descent. And I'm not going to go into the details of that. It basically uses a lot of calculus to figure out what's the optimal way to sort of traverse this landscape of this fitness landscape or this loss landscape. But it turns out that if your networks are very, very large, those little gradients, those little changes between dials end up sort of shrinking and becoming smaller and smaller as you go deeper and deeper into the network, and they kind of just vanish to the point of not really influencing your end result. So recurrent neural networks had this problem. That there was a new development called long short-term memory RNNs, or recurrent neural networks, that kind of addressed that by basically redesigning the architecture so that you essentially what you were trying to do is kind of transmit an image across time, or it's not an image, but a signal across time. And then at each step, you sort of influence that signal or not at various levels. And that improved things quite a bit. And so up until 5 years ago, long short-term memory RNNs were kind of the best out there for dealing with sequential data. But then in 2017, everything changed. Yeah.
Is that like what they used to suggest the next thing in an email or something?
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure that RNNs are what most sort of autocomplete functions use, for on your phone or on emails, right? Is to use a simple RNN for that. So in 2017, everything changed. There's a paper that came out mostly by Google researchers called "Attention is All You Need." And so when you look at when you do any sort of reading about transformer models, this is the seminal paper. This paper changed everything in the way people do deep learning. Okay, and they did it with the intent of, well, their use case was language translation. So they wanted to translate, for example, from French to English. So they proposed this transformer model that had two components to it. On the left, you had what's called an encoder, which takes one sequence, like for example, in French. And then on the right, you have a decoder, which you're trying to decode maybe into English or vice versa or whatever. And so these encoder-decoder transformers, they introduced a new sort of paradigm called attention, and specifically self-attention and cross-attention. So, and what that means is basically you're training the network to pay attention to different aspects of your input sequence. And that attention is the crux of everything in transformer models. And we're going to go into detail on how that attention is calculated, and how all that works. But in general, this tended to replace convolutional neural networks and recurrent neural networks across all sorts of data modalities. So it turns out you can take an image and serialize it into patches and use transformers on images. And so a lot of people are now doing that instead of convolutional neural networks. You can do it on text, obviously, video, audio. Transformers are kind of the hot thing right now. The other thing about them that makes them very compelling is they're very parallelizable. So a lot of the calculations that you're doing when you're calculating attention, you can do in parallel. And so that parallelization takes advantage of the GPUs, like I mentioned earlier, in order to do things very quickly. Okay, so some of the use of transformer networks in the last 5 years, right? So obviously there's ChatGPT, which is basically just one big transformer network. Bard, Anthropic, those are and Llama from Meta. Those are kind of the big, large language models that you're probably already familiar with. It's being used for science and engineering. AlphaFold, which is a scientific application for learning how to fold proteins, uses transformer networks, because what are proteins? They're sequences of amino acids, right? Used in computational chemistry, all sorts of things. The use for bioinformatics is almost endless because a lot of it's sequential data, right? Your genome is a sequence. So imagine the things you can do with it. And now with computer vision, with vision transformers and things like that. Again, by converting images into sequences and then being able to process those. So lots of transformers. Okay, so what are the parts of the transformer? So again, on the left-hand side of this diagram, you can see sort of the encoder part. And it turns out what we're going to implement today is a decoder-only transformer. And that's what GPT is, right? It's a decoder-only, which means that you're working with an input sequence and you're processing it using self-attention, but you're not encoding one sequence and decoding it into another. You're just sort of doing next token prediction on one sequence. And so the big thing is, let's just focus on the decoder only, which is sort of the middle piece there, the longer part of the architecture. So what you do is you get, and we're going to go into these pieces in detail, but you start out with what's called an embedding. And your embedding is basically data structure that encapsulates the semantic meaning of all of your tokens. And I'll go into what a token is, but you can think of it as, for large language models, think of it as a word. It's the semantic description of all of your words in numeric form. And we'll go into detail with that. Then you have to do what's called positional encoding, which is you take transformer models work in parallel, and they are not inherently aware of the ordering of the sequence. You have to tell it what the order of the sequence is. So you have to tell it where the relative positions of all of your tokens are in your sequence. So that's a second part that you add on. And then you do this multi-attention, which is where you have what are called attention heads, and you have multiple attention heads. And each one of these heads pays attention to different aspects of your input sequence. And they can be looking at wildly different parts of the sequence, and what it might determine what, they might be looking at things that they think are important, but they do it sort of in parallel, separately. But then you take the results of all of these attention heads and sort of concatenate them and do a little bit of normalization and stuff like that. And at the end of it, you end up with an output probability. And the thing is, these transformers can be put into layers, sequential layers. So this entire structure that I'm showing you here can be repeated n number of times. And it's sort of like what we do with hidden layers in a neural network, where each subsequent layer of your transformer is looking at a different level of detail or granularity or feature complexity, as you go. And so these things can actually get very large, because each one of these, what they call attention blocks or transformer blocks, can have, say, 100 attention heads each, and then you could have 100 of them in sequence. So you end up with huge networks that have enormous number of trainable parameters. So again, decoder only transformers, in our case, we're going to be looking at next token prediction. That's one use of a transformer. You can do other things with transformers in text, like, for example, classification or sentiment analysis. There's a number of things you can do, but we're going to do next token prediction, which is what GPT and ChatGPT does. And so we look at the current text sequence, we predict the next word, we add that word to our current text sequence in our context window, and then we repeat that process. And, as magical as GPT-4 seems to be, all it's doing is predicting the very next token in the sequence, right? And it's doing that based on this huge corpus of data that it's learned, but it's really just sampling from that distribution to choose the most probable next token. Now breaking this down a little bit further in a little bit more detail, looking at the decoder only transformer, again, we get our text and position embeddings. We'll just pretend that that's already done. We go through a process. We're going from the bottom up here. I'm having a hard time finding my cursor here. We're going to go from bottom up, right? So in the next sort of transformer block, we apply what's called masked multi self-attention. So multi-attention, I already told you there's different attention heads. The masked part comes from the fact that you want to make sure that when you're looking at a sequence, you're predicting what's the next token for every position in that sequence, not just the last position, but every position in the sequence. And when you're training it, you don't want it to know what happens in the future, right? You want it to only look at the context leading up to that token in the sequence and nothing in the future. So you apply what's called a mask, and I'll show you how to do that in code in a minute. You do some layer normalization so that the results from all of those multiple attention heads are sort of harmonized at the same sort of level and scale. You apply some sort of conventional feed forward or fully connected networks to then take the results of those self-attention, the normalized self-attention scores, and extract additional stuff from that. And then you can do things like text prediction and classification. Okay, so a tokenizer. Let's start with the tokenizer. These frameworks can't deal with text, right? They have to deal with numbers. So you have to convert your text into numbers. And so that's all a tokenizer really is. And so you can tokenize at various levels. You can tokenize at individual character levels, which is what we're doing with our Shakespeare model. You can tokenize at the sub-word level, the word level. You can even tokenize at partial sentences. There are trade-offs for these different things. If you're tokenizing at the character level, the number of characters, the number of tokens in your vocabulary are going to be relatively small. So in our Shakespeare, it turns out that in the complete works of Shakespeare, there's 107 unique characters, at least in the version that I downloaded, right? So that's all the uppercase, all the lowercase, the numbers, punctuation, special characters like space, carriage return. There's 107 of them. Or you could do it by words. How many words are there in the English language? There's tens of thousands of them, but you could do it at the word level. But it turns out that for models like GPT, they do it at the sub-word level, which is to say, in this example, we use unfriendly. We break that up into subwords, and each subword is its own token. And so a word is usually composed of multiple subwords or multiple tokens. And that tends to be the most, that's kind of the sweet spot for these large language models. And so in that case, GPT uses, at least GPT-2, and I think 3 as well, uses about 50,000 subwords, right? So its vocabulary is 50,000 long. There are, it's really easy to tokenize. There's lots of libraries out there in Python to do that. Here I show you from the transformers library how to load the BERT transformer. BERT is a large language framework and set of tools from Google. And using the BERT framework, we can easily take text like hello world and encode it, and we basically tokenize it. And then from that, when you have it tokenized now the computer can understand it, right? So that's tokenization. Tokenization at the character level is really easy. It's a simple lookup, right? The letter A has a number associated with it. Letter B has a different number associated with it. It's super easy to go both ways. Yeah.
When you say they're pre-trained, is it because they're machine learning models?
Yeah, so for the subword tokenizers, usually those are built using machine learning methods to pick out where, to determine where the subwords are and how to combine them and build that vocabulary. And so, yeah, they're pre-trained. I don't know that they have to be, but certainly at the character level, you don't need to do that. But when you're dealing with more complicated language, they use AI models to develop those tokenizers. Okay, and then the next thing you do is you take these tokens, and so on the left here you see here's the string, and there's some special characters like padding and stuff like that, and then there's actual, in this case we're looking at words as tokens. Those are the token strings. You tokenize those into numbers, and then you extract what's called an embedding vector. And so the embedding vector is actually this really long set of numbers. Floating point numbers, right? And so in the case of GPT, that they use embedding vectors of, at least GPT-3 uses embedding vectors that are 12,888 floating point values long, right? And so, but what these embedding vectors do is they basically capture the deeper semantic context of a word or text chunk or image or anything, right? They for whatever object you're creating an embedding vector for, it is a hyperdimensional representation of the semantic meaning of that object in the context of your overall corpus, right? And it's basically derived by looking at sort of multi-scale co-occurrence of that object, in sequences. So when I say objects, we'll say it's a word. Where does this word appear in your language corpus relative to everything else? That embedding is actually learned. It's learned as you try to train a model like a next token predictor transformer. That embedding thing is a learnable set of parameters. Again, OpenAI GPT-3 DaVinci has an embedding layer that is the size of your vocabulary times this 12,888 number, which I'm not sure where they got that from, but so it ends up to be this really, really big thing. Now, the thing is, you really think of them as vectors, like in physics, where you have a amplitude and a direction, because that defines the semantic direction in this like hyperdimensional space for that particular thing. And so, yeah.
The size of the- So I mean, this is the space that you're fitting on, right? Like what a 12,000
Mhm.
Is there any sort of rule of thumb for how big that space, the vector should be with respect to the size of the vocabulary in order to get, you know, like a good fit?
I'm sure that there are rules of thumb, and there's definitely trade-offs, right? So if your embedding vector is too small, you're not going to be able to capture as much of the semantic nuance. You know, I'm guessing they didn't come up with the 12,888, you know, by chance. I think they probably tuned a bunch of dials until they realized that was the optimal number. And you know, I don't know what the rules of thumb are for that. But if it's too long, then things become computationally expensive and memory expensive. And so there's a trade-off there for sure.
At some point, you're gonna have a larger dimensional space than you actually are representing.
Yeah.
Data.
Right. And so so like GPT is trained on basically all the words, right? You know, it's trained off of huge swaths of the internet and all the books and everything like that. And so, so it needs a big, embedding vector. Other things like, so for example, in the last talk, I talked about this clip model that just takes images and text and creates embedding vectors. And those captions aren't that, describing the pictures aren't that long. And it uses an embedding vector of size 512, so much, much, much smaller, right? Because the text isn't that long, the nuance in the semantics isn't that big. So yeah, it really depends on your data set and sort of the complexity of your vocabulary and everything like that. But the thing about treating them as vectors, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so like when you have something like, say, like live and live, is the semantic difference between those kind of things embedded in the vector, or tokenized or somehow splitting it out before that and then two different?
No, it's in the embedding vector. So that would be one token, but it's treated as, that nuance is captured in the embedding vector. Yeah, exactly. And so, so the thing about treating them as vectors is that you can compare the angles of those vectors to figure out how similar in semantic meaning two different embedding vectors are. And you can do that simply by taking their cosine or their dot product. So it's a super easy method of sort of organizing your embedding space in a way that you can then do things like similarity search and stuff like that. The idea is that once trained, this embedding vector, things that are similar semantically or in, are correlated via in language are going to end up being, they're going to have embedding vectors that tend to point in the same direction or nearly the same direction. And that's going to be really important to what's next. The embedding layer, so the GPT, all these transformers use this embedding layer, and really it's a compressed, lossy version of the entire training corpus, right? It's a kind of a gestalt representation of all of human language, concepts, facts, and everything that's been scraped off the internet. This embedding layer for GPT-3 is, if you look at it, is only about 2.6 gigs, right? So taking the entire human language and convert, everything that's ever been written and turning it into 2.6 gigs represented in this embedding space. Now, obviously it's lossy. You can't, it's not capturing everything, but it's capturing the nuance of how all of the tokens are related to each other at various levels via that multi-attention head mechanism. And this semantic embedding layer is what at least the first layer of your self-attention mechanisms work on. Okay, it works directly off of that. And again, those token embeddings are learned in the process of training your LLM to do something else, to do, for example, next token prediction. To optimize that, it will require tuning your embedding layer so that those semantic vectors end up getting aligned correctly. And so those become part of your overall, I didn't finish this slide, but the vocabulary size, again, was 107 unique characters, and the embedding size, I think I used 128. I think pretty small compared to, what we used in OpenAI. So self-attention, does this, right? So it takes your input sequence. So imagine this is your input sequence on the left and on the right, right? And what it does is it takes every token and it compares it to every other token. It's actually comparing the embedding vectors. And so it's doing it in this pairwise way across your entire context length, right? That is, you know, so the gets compared to itself and everything else in the context window. Animal gets compared to itself and everything else in the context window, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it does that every time you need to predict the next token. It goes through this process. So it's very computationally expensive because these context windows can be 4,000 characters. In the case of Anthropic's Claude, they're 100,000 characters. So imagine 100,000 by 100,000, right? I mean, it's a large amount of computation that has to happen. So let's break down. You know, so we have to pay attention to you know, basically we're looking at what words are really the most relevant to any particular token in your sequence, right? And you basically create like a weighted set of, you create a set of weights essentially, which kind of tell you which ones are the most important. So the self-attention heads, like I said before, does a couple of things. The first thing is that each one of them has 3 vectors associated with it. It has a query vector, a key vector, and a value vector. The query vector, let me see if I can, yeah, I'll go to this page here real quick. I'll go back to the other one. So the query vector is a vectorized encoding that captures how much each token in the sequence should be attended to relative to the current token, right? So it's just this long query vector that you can populate. Then there's a key vector. So that's an encoding that's used to represent the scoring of every token's query. So every token has all 3 of these vectors, and they have to evaluate them in the context of all the other tokens, query, key, and value vectors, okay? And so that process of doing that involves taking a set of trainable weights. There's these weight matrices that we apply to the embedding that basically you get in your sequence. Like if you have a sentence, for example, that's your sequence, you get the embedding vectors for every token. You build a matrix out of that. You multiply it by this weight matrix. And the weight matrix is trainable, right? So you don't build this weight matrix from scratch. It's trained as you learn the model. And then you develop this query, this resulting query vector for every token. And you do that with queries and keys. And the idea is the query represents kind of a question from a token's perspective, and a key represents kind of the answer to that question, right? And the way that those get evaluated is by doing dot products. You're basically, again, a dot product is a way of looking at the angle between, or the angle between 2 vectors. And so those dot products are what are used over and over and over again from every token to every other token to evaluate those query and key vectors that are the attention head is tracking. So those attention, so you develop an attention score by doing the dot product of a query vector and the transpose of its key vector. And the result is you get an n by n matrix where n is your context window length, right? So it's the size of all your tokens in your context window. You get a set of scores, right? And you scale that. You typically scale that because if you have a very large context window, those numbers get really big. So you scale it usually by multiplying it by the square root of the length of your embedding vector. And then you do what's called a softmax, which converts those scores into probabilities. And those probabilities become what they call the attention weights. And now you take those attention weights and you multiply them. Because those weights are another vector, right? You multiply those attention weights by your value vector. And again, your value vector is kind of the representation of what any given token actually represents in the context of the overall sequence. And so, again, these attention heads have queries, values, and keys. And it's all about dot products. Now, the thing is, doing these pairwise dot products, you have to do it between every pair of sequences in a pairwise fashion. that's an n squared algorithm, right? Where n is the length of your context window. So as your context window gets large, that becomes very computationally intensive. And that's why these things take big machines. Okay, so looking back now at this diagram that I kind of skipped over, we do the, if you look at the rightmost scale dot product attention, that just explains how the query key and value vectors get multiplied together. So the query and key are sort of multiplied. They do the dot product to get the scores. Then you scale that, you mask it, and then you apply that to your value vectors as sort of weights. And that is sort of the output of that attention head. Now, again, you have lots of attention heads. OpenAI GPT-3 has 96 attention heads per level. So they're looking at 96 different aspects of the input sequence. And then you can repeat those. And again, GPT-3 does that 96 times. That's kind of their magic number, I guess. So 96 heads, and then they repeat those transformer blocks 96 times in sequence. And so that's why it's so big. Then at the end of that, you pass it through a feed forward network. Again, you've got your sort of attention weights. But now you want to interpret those attention weights maybe in a more complicated way. And so you use just sort of a normal, fully connected network to do that, where you usually have an expansion layer to a hidden layer that's much larger than the output from your attention head so far, and then it shrinks it back down to the same size. And the idea is, doing that, you're able to identify more nuanced sort of relationships between things based on the weights. But one of the things that I mentioned earlier, but I haven't really talked about here, is positional encoding, right? So transformers work on sequences, but they don't keep track of order. And so you have to add that sort of signal of where the tokens are relative to each other to the network. And you do this with positional encoding. And so the way that you can do that in probably a number of ways, but the way that they did it in the original Attention Is All You Need paper is to use sinusoidal encoding. So the idea is, sine waves are sort of these repeating periodic functions. And so what they do is they develop a layer, which is basically a matrix, which is the same dimension as your sequence by embedding space, and then they just add it to it, right? So at every step, your semantic sort of embedding vectors represent the semantics of that token, right, relative to everything else. But then they overlay positional stuff on it, and so the question that I would have is, well, if I'm going to add these sinusoidal waveforms to the semantic sort of representation of my tokens, isn't that going to change them, right? When you just add these sort of oscillating values? And the answer is yes, it does, but it doesn't matter. And in fact, it's a good thing that it changes them, because the semantic meaning of a word depends on its relative order in a sequence. And that gets captured by doing this. So I'm not going into a lot of detail here, but the idea here is that you use waveforms of different wavelengths, depending on its position in the sequence. And the idea there is that you have a sort of a pattern, and that pattern is kind of shown there on the left there, of sort of intersecting sine and cosine waves that create this sort of identifiable pattern. And so that pattern gets overlaid through that addition to the embedding, to the embeddings. It gets kind of overlaid on top of those embeddings, and the AI is able to basically pick up on that signal and understand, to some extent, the position of that particular token relative to other tokens. So it's kind of this. I still haven't fully wrapped my mind around this positional encoding mechanism, but I kind of get it intuitively. And so that signal gets applied on top of your positional encodings. And again, the order of tokens matters. Luke destroyed the Death Star is not the same thing as the Death Star destroyed Luke. And that's a really cool AI generated picture of Luke Skywalker getting eaten by the Death Star, which I thought is pretty cool. But again, the transformer, if you do this in a consistent way with applying this pattern of the sinusoidal pattern for positional encoding on your vector, or sorry, on your matrix, then the transformer just figures it out as it goes, that learns that nuance in that signal. So there's this really cool diagram that I found on the internet, which is basically GPT-3 Da Vinci written out on a napkin, right? I can't really control this stuff to zoom in, but you should Google it or something. But it's basically the entire network, and it has all of the components that I just described, with the multi-attention heads, with the multiple layers, with the normalization functions and all that. And when you add it all up, it adds up to 175 billion trainable parameters between the embedding space, the embedding layer, and all of the weight matrices that I mentioned in the attention heads, and all of the fully connected networks that are outside of that. If you add them all up, it's 175 billion trainable parameters. So GPT-3 was trained on, Common Crawl, which is this archive of kind of internet stuff that you can just get. Yeah. Yep. So they're all 32-bit floating points by default. You can do what's called quantization, and you can turn them into integers and stuff like that if you want, for kind of trading off speed for performance and size. But but they're 32-bit floating points, so it's big, right? So Common Crawl, about 60% of GPT-3 is based on basically just the web, what it found on the web. There's web text is another 22%. A bunch of books add up to about 16%, and then Wikipedia is about 3%. So that's kind of describes what it was trained on, right? And it took about almost $5 million to train this network that you're seeing here, this written on a napkin, right? With 175 billion parameters on that amount of data. I think it was about 25 terabytes of just text. Again, got compressed down into 2.6 gigs of embedding layer. On a single GPU, it would have taken almost 335 years to run that, but they do it in parallel on lots of GPUs at great expense. That's why it's so expensive, and that's why. I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. I talked about Clip last time, which I thought was really cool. So I was like right on the edge of committing my code to GitHub, but I will do that right after this. But this URL is where it's going to be. So it's github.com Sheneman shake GPT. So this is, I want to just show that real quick. But before we kind of move to the code, I wanted to just highlight some resources that are available to you. I know I went over a ton of stuff really fast because there's just not a lot of time in 1 hour to go over everything. But there's an implementation called Nano GPT that Andre Karpathy, I think I'm saying his name right, put together, and he's got a series of YouTube videos on transformer models, and specifically how GPT works. He works at OpenAI. He was one of the founders back in the day, went to Tesla for a bunch of years and did their autopilot stuff, and then he went back to OpenAI. But he's got this really great video that I watched probably 5 times, which is implementing GPT from scratch in Python. It's about an hour and a half long. And he just kind of goes through all the steps I just did, but in code. He literally like streams the code as he's it's crazy. So you check that out if you get a chance. Okay, so I'm gonna figure out here how to stop sharing. Oh my God. Right. And now I'm going to switch back to, yeah, there we go. I think that's it. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see that. Okay, so I'm logged in right now to a server that has a pretty decent GPU on it. And I'm just going to look at the code real quick. So all of this all of this fits into 364 lines of Python code is all you need to define a transformer that can learn how to emit Shakespeare. And so first thing we do is we set up a bunch of hyperparameters, right? So our corpus is the complete works of Shakespeare, which is just about a 5 megabyte text file. It's this tiny little thing. We set up our how much of that data we want to set aside for training and how much we want to set aside for validation. So as we train, we want to make sure that we validate. So we want to evaluate our model against data we haven't seen. Our batch size, our learning rate, how big our context window is. Remember, I was talking about context windows that are 4,000 to 100,000 tokens. We're going to use a 32 token context window, so really small. Our embedding vector is going to be 64 instead of 12,888. We're going to have 6 layers. So we're going to create 6 transformer blocks in sequence. And each one of those transformer blocks will have 8 heads. And our fully connected network is going to have 8 times the kind of the remember, it expands in the middle. That hidden layer is going to be 8 times the size of its input layer. And then I created a little funny little ASCII art guy here. So we set our seed and we set our device, whether we're going to use GPU or CPU. We basically just detect if we have a GPU, and if so, we use it. That's CUDA. CUDA is the NVIDIA thing. Then we read the complete works of Shakespeare. I got this from Project Gutenberg, which is like an online repository at MIT of a lot of great books, just as ASCII text files. Read that in, figure out how many unique tokens I have, or how many unique characters are there, what our vocabulary size is. Then this is my tokenizer, right? It's a simple lookup, right? It's just tokens to characters, characters to tokens. It's a really, really simple set of Python code. Then I take, so I basically tokenize the complete works of Shakespeare into a giant tensor that PyTorch can use. And then I split that out into training and validation. So just kind of, I just do it based on percentages. I create a function that describes how to extract chunks of text, batches basically of examples. And what we want to do when we do that is we want to get the example, the input, so an input string, and then we want to get the target. What does the target look like? The target looks like the input string only shifted by 1 character, because we're predicting next characters, right? So every position needs to be shifted by 1. And what we're really interested in is, what is the very last token going to predict as the next character in the sequence? But we're going to get them all and evaluate them all in parallel. We have a sample loss as a function that I use to basically periodically see how well our model's doing. Okay, but here's kind of where the magic happens. Here's the attention head. And unfortunately, due to time, I'm not going to be able to go through this in too much detail, but definitely check out my repository in the next half hour and it'll be there. So again, this is where you define, this is the attention head mechanism. You define your query key and value vectors. You do the causal self-attention, which is where you define this triangular mask that you apply, again, so that you're playing this mask on a context window by context window matrix, so that you basically don't look at the weights associated with future tokens. Because again, if I'm trying to understand what the next token is in position 5 of my sequence, I don't want to know what it already is, right? I want to predict it. And so I mask that out using this triangular mask. Then the forward part, so this is kind of how it gets trained here. Again, this is just multiplying the query vector by the transpose of the key vector, normalizing it by the square root of the size of the embedding vector. We calculate our attention weights using our causal mask, like I just defined. We get probabilities by applying a softmax, and then the result of this is basically your attention weights. And again, it's sort of this weighted list of what any particular token needs to be paying attention to relative to its context window. The multi-head attention just sort of defines several of these together, and it defines what I call head space, which is you divide your embedding size by your number of attention heads. The idea here is that your attention heads will be looking at different parts of the embedding vector. They're not all looking at the same thing. They're looking at different parts of it. And you don't tell it what parts to look at. You don't necessarily tell it even, to separate it. You just say, you get to look at a smaller part of the embedding vector. You get to look at a small part. You get to look at a small part. And together it aggregates them all together at the end. And then so the transformer feed forward, that's just the feed forward linear network where we multiply this FFN hidden size. Again, that's a factor of 8. So we have this larger sort of middle layer of neurons there. And here's our transformer block, right? Which is you put all that together, the multi-attentions, the feed forward, and the layer normalization, that's a block. And then the actual GPT is a bunch of those blocks, basically, in a list. And then I have a method that can actually just generate text from the model. So we instantiate our model, we send it to the GPU. We instantiate our optimizer. I'm using the Atom optimizer with the learning rate I specified at the beginning. And then we train it, and the training is really easy. We just, over the specified number of batches, we pull a batch, which again describes our input and our target. The input is just a set of Shakespeare. The target is that set of Shakespeare shifted by 1. But in tensor, in embedding space tensor format, right? And then we run our model with that. And then we spit out sort of our loss as we go. And at the very end, we spew Shakespeare-ish. So real quick, I'm going to let me go over here real quick. I'm going to just run it out of here. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. It's just plain text. Yeah.
And for most large language models, is it tokenizing HTML markup and stuff too, or are they strip out that somewhere?
It's a great question. I don't know, but I suspect they're stripping it, but I don't know 100%. Yeah.
Because they can output code. Right?
Can output code.
So
yeah.
Is that like a separate training thing that they're doing, or they're just training from all?
I don't think it's a separate training thing now. But when they're just scraping the web, I think that they're converting it into just ASCII text. Maybe they're doing both. I'm not 100% sure how they organize their training data, honestly.
In theory, you could if you got TI marked up Shakespeare rather than plain text Shakespeare, where somebody's like added semantic.
Yeah.
You could actually train to have a tokenizer like split, including that semantic markup, and that would change.
Yeah.
Exactly. Get set up.
Right.
For there to be,
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure how they process their data. I'm sure that's written up somewhere. So there's a lot of papers about GPT-2 and some papers on GPT-3, not as much after that, right? They've kind of gotten more secret-y. But both Meta, with their Llama model, and Google have been a little bit more forthcoming with papers. Okay, so I trained for a very short period of time because we're out of time. I just trained for basically 600 batches. And each batch is I think 200 examples of input and output. And so the result isn't great because I didn't train it very long. It gets much better if you let it go to about 10,000 batches. But it starts to output things that kind of look like words, that are kind of structured almost like iambic pentameter poetry, kind of, sort of. I'll have to, yeah, I'll have to run it longer and provide an example of what that looks like. But it looks a lot better. It's still gibberish, because it's predicting the next character and not the next word. If it was the next, it's spending a lot of time just figuring out what's a word and what's not a word. Whereas if you're using subword tokens, all that's figured out for you, right? And so it's just a better place to operate at. So, but since we're out of time, it takes maybe 10 minutes to run it to 10,000.
So in your code, could you pop in like the BERT tokenizer and use that and see what happens to it?
I could, oh yeah, right. So I could totally do that. I could totally take this code and turn it into a subword transformer. There's nothing that would prevent that from happening. I just have to make sure that my GPU has enough memory to support matrices that have vocabularies that are that big. Right. So going from 100 and something that could literally fit on Excel spreadsheet as an embedding layer to something that's much bigger. But assuming that I could fit it on my system memory, my GPU, then yeah, I could easily turn this into a subword system. Yeah, for sure. And GPT, so OpenAI also has tokenizers that you can use as well. There's a bunch of them out there. So anyway, again, yeah, check out the GitHub repo when you get a chance. It'll be there really shortly. I just kind of ran out of time. I'm always like right up to the minute on these things for some reason. But are there any questions at all? Yeah, Arpan.
How does it predict the last token or where to stop?
How does it predict where to stop? So you can so it's like with Chat GPT and stuff like that, I think they set up sort of the sort of hard defined or hard coded sort of absolute maximum point. If they didn't have that, it would continue to emit potentially, forever. There are special tokens that they can use for beginning of sequence and end of sequence. And so I think it can learn when to emit that end of sequence token, and when it does, then it stops. So that is a capability, I believe, from what I read. This thing, I do it in batches when I'm doing the inference. When I'm trying to emit Shakespeare, I just kind of iterate on it a bunch of times and it just spits out stuff. I could make it so it just never stops, right? I don't know if that answers your question or not. So one of the questions that I had, by the way, was, so these, if you're using subword tokens, how do you handle proper nouns, right? Because names and maybe names of places aren't going to be in your vocabulary. They're not going to have tokens associated with it. And it turns out there's two different ways that's approached. One is to use a special token called out of vocabulary, which is just a placeholder token that you can use. But then if you've got multiple proper nouns in your context window, you have to kind of keep track of which out of vocabulary reference are you referring to, right? The other way and there are, I guess, ways of doing that. You can have multiple out of vocabulary, like out of vocabulary 1, out of vocabulary 2, and there's ways you can do that up to a point. The other way, from what I understand, is you can use, you also treat characters as tokens, right? So individual letters are also tokens. So in addition to the 50,000 subword tokens, individual characters can also be tokens. And in that case, proper nouns, when they get tokenized, are broken up into their individual characters and tokenized in that way. And that way you can represent a sequence of those tokens as a proper noun, and it treats it accordingly. So kind of cool. Okay, thanks, guys. Yep.